The manor walls of Blackthorn stood dark against a silver moon, their stones older than memory itself. Within those walls, candles burned low, and a widow sat by her hearth. Her name was Isolde, her hands once soft with youth, now roughened by labor and grief. Her husband had been taken by fever, and with him went the laughter of her small home on the outskirts of the Duke's lands. She lived alone in the timbered cottage her late husband built, her bed as cold as the winters that swept across the valley. The town whispered about her, the seamstress who worked by candlelight and never looked at men. The market women pitied her. The farmers glanced with silent desire. But she walked through them all guarded, her gaze lowered, her coins counted to the last. Her pockets were empty, her bread thin, and yet her pride made her shoulders square as if carrying invisible armor. Nights stretched long in silence. Sometimes she stitched gowns for noble ladies she would never meet, sending them off through servants who left coins upon her table without speaking more than necessary. Other times she sat by the window, listening to the wolves on the ridge, wondering if her heart would ever know warmth again. Loneliness pressed in like the winter winds, unseen, but sharp enough to steal her breath. On a night when frost clung to the glass and the forest groaned beneath the weight of snow, a knock came upon her wooden door. Sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She had not expected it, few dared to call upon her house at night. For a moment she sat frozen, her needle halfway through cloth, her breath misting in the cold air. The knock came again, heavier, demanding. Slowly, she rose and opened the door. Cloaked in fur, boots dusted from a long ride, stood Duke Alaric of Blackthorn. His face was sharp, carved by winters of command, his eyes as cold as river stone. Yet behind that frost, something restless flickered, something he hid behind the armor of nobility. His shadow stretched across her floor, filling her small cottage as though the manor itself had come to stand at her threshold. "Widow Isolde," he said, his voice deep and deliberate. "I have need of you." Her heart jolted. Need of her? The word struck like a blade. She stepped back wary, her hand tightening on the door. Dukes did not come to lonely cottages without reason. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her will, "you mistake the house. I have nothing here a man such as you could want." He studied her in silence, his jaw tightening as though weighing whether to leave or step further in. The fire behind her cracked, throwing shadows across the walls. Then he spoke words that made the embers roar hotter, words that pulled the ground from beneath her. "Your pockets are empty, Isolde, and my bed is lonelier still." The air seemed to vanish. She froze, every breath trapped in her chest. No man had dared speak to her so, not since her husband was lowered into the ground, not since she buried her laughter with him. Yet the Duke, untouchable, forbidden, ruler of her lands, stood before her, unashamed in his truth. Her lips parted, but no sound escaped. Her hands trembled against her skirts, the silence between them thickening, heavy with danger and desire alike. For what he spoke was no jest, no passing indulgence of a bored nobleman. His eyes did not waver. His meaning was plain. He wanted her, not as a servant, not as a seamstress, but as a woman. And in that moment, with snow whispering against the windows and firelight quivering upon her face, the widow understood that her world, once bound by grief and silence, had shifted forever. The days that followed spun like a storm inside her. She tried to sew, but her hands trembled. The needle slipped, pricking her skin until tiny beads of blood stained the fabric, but she barely noticed. She tried to pray, but the whisper of his words drowned every scripture. "Your pockets are empty, and my bed is lonelier still." The memory coiled through her veins like fire she could not put out. At market, she felt eyes upon her, as if the townsfolk somehow knew. But none could know, for she had told no one of the Duke's visit. Still, every face seemed suspicious, every voice seemed sharper. Even the way the butcher's wife handed her bread felt heavy with accusation. At night she lay awake, staring at the rafters, clutching the blankets that held no warmth. Her husband's absence had long been her only companion, and yet now it was not grief that haunted her bed, but the thought of the Duke's eyes, his voice, his presence. She tried to curse him in her heart, to hate him for daring to speak so boldly, but hatred slipped too easily into longing. On the third night, he came again. She had sensed him before the knock came, a shift in the air, a stillness in the forest beyond her window. This time, she barred the door, sliding the iron bolt firmly into place. When the knock came, it was heavier, commanding, reverberating through the walls as though the manor itself demanded entry. Her heart pounded like a trapped bird, fluttering frantically against her ribs, but she would not open. She pressed her back against the wood, her breath ragged, her palms damp. "Isolde," his voice called through the dark, low and relentless. "You fear scandal. You fear shame. Yet I fear neither." The words burned through the barrier, igniting her chest. She hated how much they called to her. She hated that her loneliness screamed louder than her pride, that her heart begged louder than her reason. Her hands trembled against the bolt. She told herself no, told herself to stay strong, told herself she would not yield. But slowly, against her will, her fingers unlatched the door. When it opened, he entered, not as a duke draped in grandeur, but as a man unburdened, his cloak damp with rain, his hair undone from the ride. The candlelight flickered across his cheekbones, casting his face in a rawness that startled her. He stood close enough that the scent of cedar and leather clung to him, wrapping around her like an embrace she did not permit. "I buried my wife 2 years before you buried your husband," he said, his voice stripped bare, raw with confession. "Since then, I have shared my hall with silence. The lords bring me banquets, the ladies bring me smiles, but none bring me truth. You, widow, carry truth in your eyes. You do not bow, you do not simper. And I cannot bear my loneliness another night." Her throat tightened, her lips parting though no sound came. She could not look away. She wanted to resist him, to remind him of duty, of scandal, of the gulf that stretched like an abyss between a duke and a seamstress. But his eyes, dark, tormented, desperate, pulled her into a tide she could not fight. Still, her words came sharp, her voice trembling. "If I step into your bed, my lord, I lose everything. The women will spit on my name. The priests will curse me. And you, will you keep me or cast me aside when whispers grow too loud?" For the first time, his control cracked. His hand trembled as it lifted to her cheek, hesitating before it brushed her skin with a tenderness she had not felt in years. The touch was so fragile it made her ache, as if she were glass he feared to shatter. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "I would keep you even if kingdoms fell." Her breath caught, her chest rising sharply as if air itself had betrayed her. The forbidden truth lay between them like a flame, brilliant, dangerous, and impossible to extinguish. She should have turned him out, should have demanded he leave her in peace and never return. She should have closed the door, bolted it, and prayed for her heart to still. Instead, she stood in the silence, trembling, the world narrowing to the space between them. And in that silence, heavy with everything unsaid, his lips found hers. The kiss was not gentle, nor was it violent. It was desperate, the kind of hunger born not of lust alone but of years starved of companionship, of warmth, of another soul's truth. Her hands rose against his chest, not to push him away, but to cling to the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath his damp cloak. His fingers slid into her hair, pulling her closer, as though even the inches between them were unbearable. When at last he broke away, their foreheads rested together, their breaths ragged in the flickering light. He did not speak again, nor did she. Words had already been left behind, burned to ash in the fire that now bound them. The world outside her cottage still held scandal, judgment, and ruin. But within those walls, in that moment, all that existed was a widow and a duke, both stripped bare of titles and grief, holding on to a forbidden truth that neither could release. The affair did not stay hidden for long. Blackthorn's walls were thick with ears, and its people fed on rumor as though it were bread. The duke's horse seen tethered outside her cottage, his shadow slipping from her door before dawn, such things could not escape gossip. At first, it was only whispers at the market, curious glances lingering too long. But whispers grew teeth, and before long, suspicion turned to accusation. At church, heads turned away from her. Neighbors who once pitied her now crossed themselves when she passed, as though her very presence carried sin. The women hissed beneath their breath, words meant to sting and shame. The widow spreads her skirts for coin. She ensnares the duke for power. A seamstress clawing her way into a duchess's bed. The cruel words fell like stones, each one bruising deeper than the last. Isolde bore them in silence, her lips tight, her eyes fixed on the ground. She had known the risk when she first let the duke into her heart, yet she had not known how merciless the world could be. Still, she told herself she could endure it. So long as her nights remained filled with the warmth of his arms, she could endure the chill of their stares. But the weight grew unbearable the morning the priest called her name from the pulpit. His voice thundered across the chapel, cold and merciless. He named her a temptress, Eve reborn, a woman sent to undo the house of Blackthorn. He spoke of her as a curse upon the land, her name spat like poison, and the congregation nodded in grim approval. Her strength shattered. She fled the chapel in tears, her hands covering her face, stumbling into the sunlight as if chased by fire. Outside, she found him waiting, Duke Alaric, his dark cloak stark against the pale morning, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with fury. He looked upon her as if he would strike down the whole town for daring to wound her. "They will not touch you," he swore, his voice low and dangerous. His hand reached for hers, steadying her trembling body. She gripped his arm as though it were the only thing holding her upright. "You do not see, my lord. You are duke, they dare not curse you. But I," her voice cracked, breaking under the truth, "I am nothing. They will break me with their tongues." His gaze seared into hers, his expression carved in unyielding resolve. "Then let them choke on their envy. You are mine, Isolde. And I will claim you before them all." The promise sent dread through her veins. He spoke as though declaring her would silence the world, but she knew the danger of such defiance. Nobles would revolt, priests would thunder, and whispers would turn to daggers. His very title could be threatened, his power tested, the weight of tradition turned against him. Yet his hand tightened around hers with such certainty that for a fleeting moment, she almost believed him. That night, she lay in his chambers within Blackthorn's stone walls, her body curled against his as snow drifted against the windows. In his arms, she felt a fire that banished every cruel word, every hiss, every curse. His lips against her skin, his voice whispering her name in the dark, it was tenderness and fury and hunger all at once. Here, she was not widow, nor seamstress, nor outcast. She was his. But with each dawn, the consequence grew heavier. Servants lowered their eyes when she passed, yet she could feel their judgment like a knife at her back. Nobles began to murmur, their resentment spreading through halls that once obeyed him without question. The church's warnings grew louder, sermons filled with veiled threats that sought to separate them by force of fear. She dreamed of another life, one where she could love him without fear, where the world would see only a man and a woman bound by something pure. But in Blackthorn, such love was no tale to be told, it was a scandal, a sin to be punished. And though their nights burned with passion, each sunrise brought a shadow over their hearts. For love in a world that would not allow it was not freedom. It was war. Winter came, snow blanketing the land in silence, turning the fields and forests into a shroud of white. Isolde's cottage, once warmed by her husband's laughter, grew colder with every passing night. The hearth burned low, for wood was scarce, and the cupboards were emptier than they had ever been. Her work as a seamstress faltered, fewer dared to hire the widows scorned by priests, and even those who once pitied her now turned their faces away. At the market, doors closed before she reached them, coins refused her hand, whispers louder than the wind following her every step. One night, she sat by her bed, the silence pressing against her chest until she could hardly breathe. The bed was vast in its emptiness, its cold sheets mocking her with the absence of comfort. Her tears soaked her hands as she bent forward, shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. Loneliness was one thing, but to be condemned by the world while hunger hollowed her body, that was another torment entirely. When Alaric came, she did not rise to greet him. She stayed on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards, her hair falling around her face. His shadow filled the doorway, and still, she did not look up. Only when he stepped closer, the firelight touching his features, did she lift her eyes. And in her gaze, there was no longing, only despair. "My pockets are empty," she whispered, her voice raw. "My bed is empty. And if I continue, my soul will be empty too. You are Duke. You can endure scandal. But I," her words faltered, breaking on the truth that had weighed her down too long, "I am breaking." He stood silent, his tall frame outlined against the flickering firelight. His face was shadowed, unreadable, and for a moment, terror lanced through her heart. Would he leave? Would he choose his crown, his people, his honor over her? Would he let her sink into ruin while he retreated back to Blackthorn's halls of stone and power? The silence stretched, unbearable. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric sank to his knees before her, the weight of his pride, his title, his very crown cast aside in that single gesture. No man of rank had ever bowed before her. No one had ever lowered themselves to meet her so humbly. She stared down at him, her tears glistening, her heart hammering in disbelief. "Then let us break together," he whispered, his voice trembling with a truth more powerful than any vow. "For I would rather have nothing with you than everything without you." Her sobs tore free, unchained at last. She reached for him, clutching him with a desperation that had been buried for too long. Her arms clung to his neck, her tears falling against his shoulder. In his embrace, she no longer felt abandoned. She no longer felt cursed. For the first time since the fever had stolen her husband, she felt seen, truly seen, not as a seamstress, not as a widow, not as a scandal, but as a woman worthy of being chosen. That night, their love burned brighter than fire and fiercer than storm. Forbidden it may have been, but in the stillness of the cottage, with snow pressing against the windows, it became unshakable truth. They belonged to each other, regardless of what the world screamed outside those walls. When spring came, the bells of Blackthorn tolled. Not for scandal, not for shame, but for a union no one could silence. The town gathered in disbelief, the nobles bristled in outrage, the priests thundered warnings from their pulpits, but Alaric did not waver. He stood before his people, Isolde at his side, her hand trembling in his but never pulling away. Empty pockets met an empty bed, he declared, his voice echoing against the ancient walls of the square, steady and unyielding, but in each other, we found a fullness no kingdom can deny. The crowd gasped. Some cried out in fury, others in shock. The priests raised their hands as if to condemn them both. But the Duke's hand never left hers. His grip was strong, defiant, binding them together against the tide of the world. For the widow's bed was no longer lonely. And the Duke's chambers no longer echoed with silence. What they found together was not wealth, nor power, nor approval. It was something far greater, something rare and unyielding, the forbidden grace of love that dared to defy the world itself. And though the shadows of judgment would linger, their bond was no longer fragile. It was iron forged in fire, and nothing, not crown, not church, not whispered hatred, could tear it apart.